matters. So for the record, those present are myself, Commissioner Dimchaco, Commissioner Martinez. Excused are Commissioner Sanchez and Commissioner Santos. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We apologize. The first issue for decision, Resolution 44 FY 2023, we're tabling that. We're not. Quite ready to bring that to you yet.
Okay.
So, Resolution 45 FY 2023 seeks to obtain increased funding authorization for wastewater chemical supply contracts. Okay. Essentially, we have two different contracts, one for both for wastewater treatment chemicals, but one specifically for coagulant, ACH, and then another contract for cationic and anionic polymers. The two contracts are with Total Chemical, and the board previously provided authorization in the amount of $2.6 million plus a 10% contingency for a total of $2.8 million for 3 years plus two 1-year options to extend. That was with Total Chemical Resources for the ACH. And then with JMI, the board previously approved a approximately $1 million contract with a 10% contingency for a total funding authorization of $1.17 million for 3 years plus 1-year extensions. We are currently in option year 1, which ends in December of 2023, and we are concerned that we may not have sufficient funding for the chemicals that we will need. So we're seeking an additional amounts for each of the contracts. For Total Chemical, we are seeking an additional $1 million, not to exceed amount for the remaining, the remainder of this option year, and then one more option year. And then for the cationic and anionic polymers with JMI, we are seeking additional funding authorization in the amounts of $700,000 for each product. So that would be $1.4 million for the remainder of this year and one further option year for that contract. These will be used at the Northern District, Hagatna, and Agate Santa Rita wastewater treatment plants. As we continue to optimize Northern District, now that we have it online and we are evaluating how we might adjust our chemical feed rates, I anticipate that the amounts that the rate at which we're using these chemicals may go down, but we're being a little bit cautious with the amounts that we're requesting just to make sure we have sufficient funding authorization. These are not to exceed amounts, so if we don't need it, we won't use it, but we'd like to have your authority to increase the funding authorization.
Any questions? This is stuff you have to have
That's correct, sir.
to make the plants run. Okay.
I'm going to ask the AGM of administration to go over the next two, which involve creation of positions.
Okay.
Thank you, Miguel. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Resolution 46 FY 2023 is relative to the adoption of the auditor series of positions to the GWA Certified Technical Professional list. The internal auditor is responsible for evaluating the organizational risk, controls, compliance, and efficient and proper use of GWA resources. Over the last 5 years, the amount of work required by the internal auditor has exceeded the capacity for one full-time employee. Therefore, we're asking to adopt in the auditor series, which already exists, into our CTP list. This request is necessary and urgent to support GWA's initiatives to improve performance in all of our business processes and expand its implementation and proper execution of our SOPs, and then also to timely address any complaints or allegations of fraud, waste, and abuse. The auditor's series of positions will be organizationally structured in the general manager's office under the internal auditor. The pay ranges for the auditors 1, 2, and 3 are listed below, and these are based on the 20th market percentile of the 2017 market study. And this will be these positions will be funded by GWA revenues. The plan is to hire in one position, and there has been a current vacancy identified that will be retired or put back into the inventory and replaced by this position.
So this is not an increase in the number of people working at GWA?
No.
What's your current staffing level?
We have 368. It's 359?
259?
359.
Oh, 359.
So we have been losing people. We have one of our brightest young wastewater treatment plant operators give us his 2 weeks notice. I think his last day was last week. So he's gone on to work for federal government.
Federal government. Can't compete. Hard. And we really need that talent. We're going to have to do something. We are supposed to update the name of the guy.
Alan Searle?
The Alan Searle study.
Correct.
When is that happening?
So the study's been updated, and we're just pending presentation of the results. So it was updated based on 2022 market data.
Chris, is there any, what's the logic or rationale putting him into CTP, the Certified Technical Professional? Is it just, was it not previously a CTP position?
That's correct. When CTP was adopted for GWA, it was not included. The internal auditor was, but these auditor positions were not. So now we're just placing them into our CTP position inventory.
Is there any particular reason that's being done?
Well, all of our positions go into that category, so we can pay them on the Alan Searle pay scale.
That's the rationale, is that if they weren't, they wouldn't be on that pay scale?
Correct.
And then their pay would be set
It would be set by the government of Guam pay scale. And so right now the difference, Auditor 1 with government of Guam entry salary is $45,000. Under the CTP scale, it's $50,000. So about a $5,000 difference.
So how many other positions within GWA are not CTP? And why is there two standards?
Well, so when we created the CTP pay scale, that was to certify, it was to allow us to have our own pay scale so that we could recognize, positions requiring higher pay than the general pay plan. And so
the appropriate certifications, right, for operators, right?
yeah.
So auditors have a specific type of certification that classifies them to be CTP?
They can.
Do ours?
Yes.
I believe so.
Okay. And the so going forward, those job ads will require that same certification?
Well, the current IA has the certification. I'm not sure if that certification is required for all levels of the series.
Okay. So it's to put them into a pay scale, but the logic on that they have to have some sort of certification or professional, designation does not have to be followed.
I believe when the pay scale was initially created, there was certain certifications that need to be done for being a employee of the water or power utility. And so those are the certifications that separate them from the general pay plan scale and our scale. And they center around cybersecurity and some other utility-based certifications.
Okay. No, I get the logic. It just seems like it's not an absolute. You're using it to justify, or not justify, you're using it to kind of classify an employee, but I think what I'm hearing is that this auditor doesn't necessarily have to have it.
I'm sorry, I may have misspoke. I meant I don't know that it's required for all
Oh, okay.
series, so that the entry level, I don't know that it's required, but I think we have it in the, for the higher positions, including, well, the IA that we have now has it.
Okay.
And we don't have any current employees or positions that are not part of the CTP position inventory. Like, we don't have anybody that's on the general pay plan, pay scale, and then other employees on the CTP. Everybody aligns within the CTP pay scale.
Everybody in a certain job classification, either or. It's not, there's not a mixture of the two.
Not within our organization.
But not everybody in GWA is on the CTP.
They are.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, they all are?
Yeah, that's what I'm
Okay.
saying.
So
We don't
they
have
all-
any that are on general pay plan. Everybody is on the CTP.
Except for this series.
Correct. The series was not included when we initially
Oh,
brought in the
okay.
CTP pay
Because we
scale.
only had one IA.
We didn't anticipate having to bring in a lower level auditor.
So it's the job classification auditor 1, 2, or 3 that it requires that CTP designation because it wasn't previously part of your
That's correct.
staffing pattern.
Right.
Okay, okay, that clears it. I just, for some reason, I thought that you had 2 classifications, CTP and non-CTP. That's not the case, okay.
All right, thank you. The next resolution, 48-FY 2023, amends the title of the Trouble Dispatch Supervisor to Water Communications Dispatcher Supervisor, and it updates the position classification specification. This project objective is necessary and urgent because, back when the Trouble Dispatcher Supervisor was created, GWA had established the Water Systems Control Center specifically for system status monitoring and control coordination. And it staffed the WSCC with certified operators at levels 1 through 4. And they were to supervise, communicate emergency repairs and system adjustments with field operations staff. The trouble dispatch function remains an integral part of this operation, but it's now focused on the intake of customer service calls and complaints in coordination with the WSCC operators. Now, over the years, we've attempted to recruit for the trouble dispatch supervisor, and we have not been successful because it requires a level 2 operator certification. Therefore, we're seeking to amend the title and also the position class specification so that we can remove that level 2 operator certification. It's not really needed anymore because the operators within the WSCC side who deal with the field operations have those certifications. This position will just focus on the intake of customer complaints and system issues, and then communicate to the public and work with the WSCC team to resolve those issues. So really their focus is going to be strictly on the customer intake, phone calls, and supervising the staff that does that work.
What kind of operator certification? Like heavy equipment operator?
The US EPA.
Oh, US
Water
EPA.
system or wastewater system operator certification. We still want the position to have the level 1 so that when they're communicating with the public, they have a good knowledge base for the overall system operation. Since it's public facing, we want them to have that knowledge. That's something just in regular communication staff that we did not have. And we're trying to remedy that to improve our communication with the public.
This position it's located in the WSCC location here in this building. It'll be funded out of GWA revenues, and when filled, we expect we will do an internal recruitment, and if successful, that position will not be backfilled, meaning it won't be an increase to our FTE counts.
People, yeah. You still need to get more people, because if you lose people, you need more people. I don't know how, that's a challenge you guys are gonna have all the time, especially with the federal government. I mean, I like the federal government, no beef, but they really are very good in their pay and benefits plan. I understand their people can gas at the military gas station. I don't know if that's true, but if that's true, that's a big benefit alone. That alone is a big benefit. Okay. Next, any questions? No? Let's go, next one.
The next resolution is 49 FY 2023, and this is seeking the board's authorization for the issuance and sale of GWA water and wastewater system revenue refunding bonds or a current or forward delivery, on a current or forward delivery basis, and then approving the forms of related documents, agreements, actions, and authorizing the execution and delivery thereof. This would be for, to refinance existing bonds that are approaching their call dates, which has, we believe, has the opportunity to save millions of dollars on finance costs. We're seeking the approval of that refunding along with a potential
Additional-
tender for bonds that are not approaching their call dates but could also be refinanced to save additional monies, and then reduce our debt service costs over the long term. The authorization is also to approve the forms of the documents that we're currently developing. So as the board may remember, we're required to prepare the preliminary draft preliminary official statement, the bond purchase agreement, and other documents. And so we have the forms attached in their current draft state. Of course, they're not completed. We are working on updating and finalizing those. If the board approves us to go out to the market, we will be doing that between now and the holidays. The refunding bonds will provide debt service cost savings and have the potential to increase debt service coverage in the years which there are savings. We anticipate that cost savings are in the multiple millions, but the final numbers will depend, of course, on market conditions at the time of issuance and the level of participation on the bond tender, refunding tender, if GWA decides to move forward with that. Tentative closing of the bonds would be by November of 2023, and for the forward refunding or forward delivery, rather, it would be in April of 2024. The refunding will be sold through a negotiated sale of our revenue bonds with proceeds used to redeem the outstanding bonds. And there are, I think, of all of our outstanding bonds for the potential tender, we have knowledge of 80 to 90% of who the owners are, and therefore would require some marketing efforts to reach out to them to see if they are willing to participate in that bond tender refunding.
Have you started the marketing effort?
So
for
only,
our investment advisors?
I think,
The EMMA notice was published on September 1st. And that allows our underwriters to start their outreach to various investment groups.
so we anticipate the timing of this, having to obtain ratings from the rating agencies in early to mid-October, and then the marketing efforts in November, early to mid-November, with the intent of getting the closing done or the sale done before the Thanksgiving holidays. After that, it would be tough to get anything done, and the market conditions appear to be right for doing this in that time frame.
And Miguel, the market conditions, I mean, right now interest rates are so high, so what is it forecasted to?
So I guess with the market conditions the way they are and the interest rates so high, there has been a rare inversion in municipal bonds where position relative to the short-term bonds and longer-term bonds, their normal relative position in terms of interest rates have flipped. And so that is creating this potential savings for us with the refunding.
And is it just immediate savings, like you know, obviously the debt service that is going to mature and you're going to have to start servicing, you're pushing it further into the future, but the total interest and debt service still, it just extends it. Right, so what's the long-term impact? I know there's talk about savings, there's immediate debt service savings to the utility, but aren't we just kind of kicking the can down the road a little bit, or no?
It can be either. It can be immediate, we can take the savings up front, or we could structure the savings to save a little bit
Over the long
over
term.
the long term, but we're not extending the term of any loan. So we're not pushing the financing further out. It would still be for the same.
Just the mature.
So the maturity date's the same, but you're just playing around with when the debt service occurs, or is there like a balloon debt service towards the latter part of the?
No, all of our debt services, the way we've structured our financing, all of the debt service is level.
Level.
So where there have been dips, the bonds have been structured to be callable, so that we fill in those dips, and so that the debt service is level.
Levelized. So maybe for the general meeting, so that, you know, any of the public that's interested, maybe just a graphic that shows and makes people understand how, you know, how you're going to achieve savings.
I mean,
Provided the
present
market,
it,
right?
right, but with
It's
the
the
appropriate
market.
qualifications that this is what our estimates are now,
Yeah.
and then as the market conditions,
We'll determine what.
based on the actual date of sale, will determine.
It's kind of like what happened with the GPA bonds, where we lost time and we ended up not saving as much money as we
Yes, we
could
did.
have, right?
Yeah.
So, okay.
Very true. Okay, next.
So, Mr. Chair, we can go through the management report, it's the normal course of business, but at the end of the last meeting, I plan to give you the more after action kind of summary. I gave you the written copy of the report, which is an internal document for critical infrastructure and security reasons, but I have a presentation to go over the basics. If you wanted me to do that now, or we could just go into the GM.
I'm fine.
Yeah, yeah, we can do.
Yeah,
we
let's
can go
do it.
through it.
Let's
Want to
do
do
this.
that one first?
Sure.
And then the GM report?
Is it in board books though?
No.
No, I didn't think so.
These first to give to the rating agencies.
I think I just want to, but even prior to going, I want to make sure I fully understand it so that when we get there, it's not like, you know, going over my head. You know.
I didn't know that
I don't know if there's anything
more is actually
that would help me.
means a rose, but I can't remember where it means a rose. But
Okay, go ahead.
this was a thorny storm. Next, please.
No, this is
So-
a bad storm, but go ahead.
We just want to go through the summary, timeline of our recovery, some challenges, milestones of the recovery process, some just general data and statistics about our recovery, and then some planned next steps. The detail of the next steps and the detail of some of the challenges are what were provided in the written report, which I gave you at the last meeting. Next, please. So this is one of the, just a photo of one of the repairs that we did immediate post-storm in Sinahanya. So in general, in terms of our recovery and response, we were initially hampered by the lack of communication amongst our field crews, especially in the south. We were unable to make contact with them immediately after the storm, and our operations staff had to first dig themselves out of the treatment plant, which had been the road to and from had been blocked. After they cleared the road, they were able to get to a place where they had service and report on what the status of everything was. So that's just an example. Access to our facilities slowed our ability to make the initial assessments with trees blocking fallen trees, blocking access roads, and debris as well. The damage that we observed affecting our operational facilities were fairly limited. We didn't have a lot of waterline damage. We didn't have a lot of physical damage to the production facilities, but we did have a lot of electrical control equipment and generators that were damaged in the immediate aftermath of the storm. Our primary response focus was, first and foremost, increasing our water production, and then trying to provide maintenance on generators and bring the non-operational generators back into service, and then managing and monitoring the water distribution system and making adjustments as we could to match production to distribution so we could get water to customers as efficiently and quickly as possible. So just in summary for the water facilities, as I mentioned, damage to generators, control boards, damage voltage regulators, radiator damage in some instances, damage to control equipment, variable frequency drives which operate the deep well pumps and motors, power control cards within those drives got burnt or damaged during the storm and in the aftermath. For the Ugam surface water treatment plant, we had a large amount of debris wash downstream and clog the intake and access to the wet well. In addition, we had silt and rocks that had gotten into the intake line, which needed to be flushed out before we could restore operations at the plant. We, throughout the distribution system, did see some instances of damaged lines from fallen trees. When the roots come up, they bring the lines up with them sometimes, and that caused some damage. On our wastewater facilities, the bigger issue for our pump stations was flooding. As you know, the gravity lines drain to the lowest point. Typically, that's where the pump stations are. It also happens to be where storm water also drains. So we had a few facilities that were inundated with stormwater, GWA sewage pump station being the worst, which is kind of counterintuitive because it's in GWA. But we'll show you some pictures of that. We did have some process equipment that was damaged, especially at Northern District Wastewater Treatment Plant at the headworks. We had equipment parts and covers for some of the channels at the headworks that had been lodged into the channels themselves, and it required us to shut the entire plant down in order to do a confined space entry into the channel and have those items retrieved. We didn't want to wash it further down the process and damage the rest of the piping and equipment at the plant. We also had some damage to generators at various locations because of the storm. Again, different types of damage, the control boards, submerged gensets that required oil changes and dry out. So those are the types of damages that we saw typically in our facilities after the storm. Just a photo of the AGM ops settling in at the control center and tracking all the information so that we could update our reports to the board. Next slide, please. So this is the immediate pre- and post-storm timeline and what we were looking at in terms of production capacity. So the dark green bars represents the number of deep wells that we had on island power. The light green bars, the number of deep wells that we had on generator power. The orange bars represent the number of wells that had non-operating generators. So the wells could run, but the generators were broken. And then the kind of burnt orange, that is the number of grounded motors that we had prior to the storm and immediately after the storm. And you can see on the 23rd pre-storm, we had 94 wells operating either on generators or island power. And at this point, the data that's collected reflects GPA and GWA coordination for bringing the generators online and taking the wells off the grid. So that happened throughout the course of the day. So this is just a snapshot of that. Same thing on the 24th. We were still in the process. You can see the number of wells on generator had increased to 47. At that point, we had 88 wells running, and then immediately after the storm, when Island Power went out, we had only 60 wells operating on generator power. And then you can see the number of wells with non-operating generators went from 0 the day before the storm, 4 during the storm, and then I think that's 32 generators and control boards, that kind of thing. That took those generators out, and those deep wells then were non-functioning. Next slide, please. So this is just a photo of our crew doing deep well pump and motor changeout. You can see they have the pump and motor there rigged up and ready to go, and the submersible cables on the spool that are getting ready to be dropped down the hole. Next slide, please. So just in terms of our production timeline, as I mentioned, the day before the storm, 94 wells operating. This kind of became our rallying call for our operations teams. This is where we met. This is what we got to get back to in order to restore the water service. So Mission 90 Wells was born out of this discussion, and our public messaging focused around us getting to 90 wells in order to get restored. Next slide, please. So over the next several slides, you see where we were on day 1, 60 wells operating. Next slide. Day 8, we had increased that number to 64. Day 19, we were at 94 operating wells. So it took us a little over 2 weeks to get to, actually day 19 is when we logged 94. We're over 90 a couple days prior, but because of our system, I wasn't sure that we could sustain it, so we didn't really declare 19. Next slide, please. So this graphic gives you a picture of our entire post-storm recovery, and the orange line at the top is the percentage of normal production, or percentage of pre-storm production, and pre-storm production was about 34 million gallons a day. The numbers you see in the blue boxes on the vertical bars, that is the actual production volume from our deep wells. So 34 day -1, and then the day after the storm we were down to 24 during the storm, and then on the 25th we were at 20 MGD. Our lowest point was on the 28th at about 17 MGD, and then we were able to get around the 12th or 13th within 90% of normal production. So we're starting to see sufficient production to meet demand, but we just didn't have the reservoir storage at that time. Next slide, please. So in terms of our distribution system, we initially were assessing it, but we didn't have any GIS information to present until about day 13 on June 6th. This was our first GIS map that we actually used customer meter locations to represent who had water and who did not. And on our first update, we had 62% of our customers with water and 38% with partial or no service. That was on day 13. Next slide, please. A couple days later, on day 15, we'd increased that number to 71% of our customers, and you can see the areas in red still remain with partial or no service. Next slide. On day 17, June 10th, we had added an additional almost 3,000 customers to being with service, and our number was at 77% and 23% with no service. Next slide. By day 21, 3 weeks after the storm, we were at 92% of our customers with service, with just some tough pockets up north near the Santa Rosa area in Gigo, Manilao, and portions of Barragata still being problematic for us with the distribution system. And you can see in Dedido, the Finnegodson area, there's some pocket outages up there. Next slide. By June 19th, day 26, we were at about 96% restored. Next slide. And then on day 29, June 22nd, we were fully restored, and then a couple days later we lifted the boil water notice. Next slide. So we went from 62% on June 6th to 100% on June 22nd, just in terms of the number of customers that we had restored to service. Picture of our lab personnel analyzing some of the samples that were collected throughout the distribution system during the storm. Next slide. So, issues that affected the public during the recovery. Of course, the most obvious being the precautionary boil water notice that was issued 1:30 p.m. On the 25th, the day after the storm. Because of the drop in reservoir levels and the anticipated duration of outage, we issued this out of an abundance of caution. Under those conditions, when there is reduced pressure, there is an increased risk of contaminants entering the system, but our testing ultimately confirmed that that did not occur. All the samples that we had taken throughout the recovery process all came back clean. Next slide. So our response included, in order to address the precautionary boil water notice, daily sampling and analysis. We took these samples at Guam EPA designated test locations where we had already restored service. You can see on the right some of the public messaging that went out on social media regarding the precautionary boil water notice, and this slide is after we actually partially lifted it in certain locations which had sustained pressure, adequate chlorine levels, and adequate reservoir levels. Next. We also made treatment adjustments. We increased their chlorine dosage just temporarily out of an abundance of caution, and we increased monitoring of residual levels within the distribution system. The distribution system manager was making constant adjustments within the distribution system, as I mentioned, to match production to distribution and make sure that we had water flowing in order to build reservoir levels. In addition, in coordination, we are also putting out conservation notices to help the public understand that by reducing their consumption at downstream areas that had water, upstream areas that were still struggling, we could build the reservoir levels to get everybody more water. So we spent a significant amount of time and effort in that public messaging to try and get everybody to understand that we needed their help to restore service.
Miguel, real quick, I don't mean to, the precautionary boil water notice, I remember this causing some confusion, like who issued it. I think there might have been like a GIFA issuance and then not associated with GWA. So are you going to go through like maybe some lessons learned?
Yeah.
Okay.
We got that. It's coming up. On the 13th, day 20, we were able to partially lift the precautionary boil water notice in most locations where we, as I mentioned, we had sustained service, adequate pressure, adequate reservoir levels, and adequate chlorine residuals. So these are the 4 conditions that Guam EPA wanted to see before they would concur with us lifting the boil water notice. We did have lots of issues on social media. There were messages circulating telling people to use as much water as they could because we were going to shut it down. Also this, which is what you're referring to, Commissioner, the Guam EPA had been made aware of private companies hauling water to restaurants and condominiums in trucks that were labeled specifically for non-potable water, and it created some concern because Guam EPA knew that some of these construction companies which use these trucks had previously requested permits for disposal of hazardous waste or investigation-derived waste. When they do hazardous waste investigations, they use wash water, and that gets put into these trucks for disposal somewhere. Well, they became aware of this, conducted their investigation, and prepared a do not drink order that was applicable to facilities who had received water from these non-potable water trucks. Somehow, it inadvertently was released by the Joint Information Center. According to Guam EPA, they intended it only to be mailed or posted at those locations where that actually occurred, but it ended up being put out on social media by the Joint Information Center, but there was no distinction that it only applied to facilities receiving water from these non-potable water trucks. So everybody was in a panic and calling us up about, is your water safe to drink or is it not? This says do not drink. And we had to put out a corrective statement, next slide, which clarified that it only applied to the businesses that had received water from non-potable water trucks, and that we had tested our water, and all of our water that we were provided either in our tanker trucks or in the flex tanks was safe to drink. So that had to be dealt with. The lesson learned there was trying to stay on top of GWA EPA's messaging as well as our own messaging. But the Joint Information Center was how we were trying to do most of our messaging, and then we just repeated what we had put into those reports in our social media messaging. The other issue that came up was whether GWA water was acceptable as source water for these little mom and pop stores that sell bottled water. And that is regulated under the Department of Public Health and Social Services, and they essentially wanted to shut everything down. GWA EPA stepped in there and tried to convince them that that wasn't necessarily the right course of action. The discussion about the precautionary boil water notice and whether that constituted a violation of national primary drinking water standards, which is, I guess, what public health's position was, that if it didn't meet primary drinking water standards, then it wasn't a safe source water. And on that basis, because GWA had issued a precautionary boil water notice, they said, nope, you can't operate. GWA EPA took a different tack, and they tried to work with public health to say, if you have a concern, we think the water's fine. If you have a concern, let's go out to these individual facilities. We'll do the testing. If it comes back clean, then the source water's clean and they can operate. And eventually, it took a while to coordinate that, but that's what they did. And so GWA EPA's efforts in post-war recovery were really largely taken up by this effort. They had all their people that were available going out and doing this testing at all these little locations, because by that time we had pretty much restored service and lifted the boil water notice in certain locations, but GWA EPA and public health were still going around doing all this testing. Right. As I mentioned, the conservation effort was critical to us trying to increase the areas that we could provide service. The governor's emergency declaration kind of helped with that. It created a little bit of a headache for us in terms of enforcement, because we would get people calling us saying, my neighbor is water blasting his roof and he's not supposed to be doing that. And so when we got calls, we would have to send out our inspector from compliance and safety. He would investigate. He would issue a notice to comply with the governor's executive order telling them to cease and desist whatever water blasting they were doing. And so it did work, and we were able to build up levels. And this is some of the messaging that we issued to the public to help them to understand that. More of that type of public messaging. And we also put out some messaging to try to help the public understand how the reservoir levels affected the use, and how they, what we did pre-storm and what happened post-storm that was causing the reservoir levels to be low. Next slide. Next slide. So in addition to that type of messaging, we also initiated a podcast series to provide daily updates on our recovery efforts. That is going to continue with just general information now. Chris is working on that program. And then we also...
Miguel, just on the podcasting stuff, I mean, do you have the metadata that shows how effective or ineffective that is?
I think we have some. I was getting updates on whether it was effective from our media consultants. So we do have some of that.
I'd be interested to see that, because most people nowadays, they have real short attention spans. Are people really listening to an entire podcast?
Well, the podcast was really short. I would do daily updates in like a minute or two. So I think they were effective. You know, some of the messaging that we saw showed that it was, you know.
I like to see the reach. I like to see the reach data. How many people listen to this? How much did it cost? And I just want to see, you know, how impactful podcasts. I'm sure they have the data, right, on how many people listen to it.
Well, the good part is you tried something, you know.
I listened to them. I thought they were pretty cool, but most people, you know, are flipping through their phones, you know, within like 10 seconds. They're not gonna, you know,
Yeah.
listen to an entire podcast.
I know.
I'm
My wife
one of
never
those
got
that
past
doesn't
me
listen.
saying my name. She just stopped me. Just again, the list of the recovery milestones. We never went below 50% production, and we throughout the storm and even throughout the recovery, we had areas that never lost water. We reached 75% production by day 11, 90% production by day 13, and we achieved mission 90 by day 18. And on day 20, we had a partial lifting of the precautionary boil water notice, full restoration by day 29, and lifting of the precautionary boil water notice island-wide by day 30. Next slide. This is the graph which kind of shows the full recovery, and I've included some lines to mark significant events. The first, of course, being the typhoon. The next purple line, you'll see FEMA/contractor assistance, and this is primarily with getting either replacement generators from FEMA deployed, or getting contractors to assist us with repairing generators that had gone down. And that happened at about day 6. So in the coordination with GPA, we recognized that they were swamped, and we were trying to do what we could to alleviate any workload on them that we could. So we undertook coordination of all the refueling of all the generator sets at water facilities, including deploying our own flatbed with a tank on it to go out and top off some of the smaller generator sites, in addition to coordinating with the GPA's vendor for fuel delivery services. We also enlisted, or we sat with them and said, why don't you guys focus on the corrective maintenance that you can do? Let us know what you can. And we have some of our maintenance team try to address the easier items, and then we'll get a contractor on board to address the major items. We had coordinated all of that by day 6 and had a contractor on board, and you can see from about that time the slope of that gold line decreasing the number of generators that were offline start to really ramp up. And within a week or so, we were down to 4 generators that were not operating. So that really helped us. And then on about the 12th, which was about 3 weeks, or 12th or 13th, that's when we hit 90 calls. But on the 6th of June, maybe a couple weeks after the storm, we have stood up another deep well contractor to assist us with the pump and motor changeouts. And so the burnt orange area at the top, after that purple line where we had another contractor on board, you can start to see we made some progress in reducing the number of grounded motors that were keeping us from using those production wells. That went from about 22 at its greatest point down to about 8 when we were fully restored. So having that second team, because it takes one team 1 full day to change 1 pump and motor. The work is so intensive. So having that contractor assistance helped us with our restoration efforts. Next slide, please. So just some of the statistics at a glance. As of the time that we prepared this for the meeting, I don't know if more numbers may have come in, but at the time that we prepared this for last month's meeting, our overtime was at about 809,000. Inventory draw was about 438,000. And contract services and material POs were at 481,000. So at that point, we were at about 1.73 million in expenses. We estimate the fuel for the generators, which is under GPA's contract, that was about 655,000 as of the time the report was prepared for more related expenses. Next slide, please. Just a comparison. These are some photos from Typhoon Omar and Pang Songwa in December of 2003. Our performance is a little bit difficult to track because it's way before our time, but Chris was able to find some statistics on this. In Omar, there were 0 water wells working the day after the storm, and by day 3, only 5 working, and then by day 5, almost 50 working, according to news articles that we were able to find at the time. For Typhoon Pang Songwa, 34 out of 110 wells were operable the day after the storm. And then for us, as I mentioned, throughout the storm, we had wells operating, 60 wells the day after the storm. So it shows some improvement, at least in terms of the initial resiliency, and then the recovery was as good as I think we could have made it. We did over 1,300 tests, water tests in the distribution system related to the typhoon. That began on May 24th and went through June 22nd. We lifted the precautionary boil water notice on the 24th. During that initial recovery period, the lab completed a whole week's worth of samples in just one day. So they were working extra hard to make sure that our water system was safe. Slide, please. We had 186 employees who were involved in the response and recovery from, including 4 operation and maintenance managers and 4 divisions, the water distribution, water production and treatment, wastewater treatment, and wastewater collections. 161 total ops personnel working 12-hour shifts, and the 12-hour shifts commenced the day before the storm and went through June 12th for most of the staff except for water production. They went on their 12-hour shifts up until July 5th, and all those change-outs pretty much. So, federal response. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Next slide. So, DOD and Joint Region, excellent. They provided immediate assistance with increased flows from both FENA and other Navy sources to help us speed our recovery. They provided coordination and quick deployment of master meter interconnections that needed to be restored, physically disconnected, but we had to go back in, dig them up, and reconnect them. They were willing to assist us with a 3rd deep well team. We just couldn't get the logistics worked out through Homeland Security. The way you ask for help, apparently, from military is very different from the way you ask for help from FEMA. So it was a different process, and by the time we got approvals to do it, we said it's okay. We seems to have things under control. FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, initially it was a little cumbersome, but once it started, it was really efficient. Those guys did a great job of getting us generators, keeping them fueled, keeping them operating. If we needed them to be pulled off, to get out of the way so we could do a pump and motor change out, even if it was only temporary, they were very responsive. In fact, they were sometimes faster than we were. So they did a great job. So thumbs up for them. Next slide. Cannot say the same thing about US EPA. Their emergency support function, they were supposed to be the water infrastructure subject matter experts, but GWA did not necessarily need water or wastewater operator expertise. We had sufficient amounts of that. What we did not have was working generators. And when we were first contacted, they said, we're here to help. This is not an enforcement action. Just give us the information that we're looking for, and so we can know how to better help you. And there wasn't anything that they could have provided us but they still were wanting information above and beyond what we were already providing to the Joint Information Center. And so it became a little bit cumbersome, but people that they initially sent out were all enforcement folks. And so even though their mission was to support, their mindset was, you know, we want to see, we want to verify what you're doing. So Guam EPA had the role of regulating us and conducting the surveys to make sure that our facilities did not sustain any damage that would affect the sanitation or the public health. And so, you know, they of course asked all the right questions in the beginning, and our folks were reporting the damages and told them what we were doing to make these corrections. And as I mentioned, we sustained very little in terms of damage of that type, physical damage to our facilities. There wasn't a whole lot. We had some covers that were blown off the top of some of the reservoirs, which the staff immediately covered temporarily with wood and then had refabricated with metal and screen as they should have been. And so that was done very quickly, and we told Guam EPA that, and they said, okay, they believed us. But the US EPA folks who were here to support demanded that we take them out there and show them. And so we had to pull people away from their response activities and then have them take these guys to the side so that they could see what we already told Guam EPA, and for which we had already provided photographic evidence. But they were just very difficult. So thumbs down for them. Areas for improvement. The first being we need better communications in-house, and I guess island-wide as a community, but that's one of the areas that we suffered. So we think that we need to invest a little bit more in that, having our own system, but then also partnering, if we can, with the telecom companies to see if there's the possibility of doing shared infrastructure where, you know, we as a critical infrastructure agency have access to telecoms communication for our own folks to make sure we can speed up recovery and response. Capital replacement and improvements for our generators and facility controls, the stuff that got damaged by you know, the wind and the rain, wind-driven rain. Hardening our facilities to put the generators inside. We have some sites where they just sit outside and don't necessarily have a building. We might want to change that. We want to put all of our control equipment inside an enclosed space that is better protected, and expand and include SCADA systems so that we can have real-time monitoring on system status. We think we could do a better job of generator maintenance, augmenting what GPA is already doing. When we do capital replacements, we should consider maintenance contracts that go with generators, new generators that are provided as a standard of our procurement. For existing units that aren't being replaced, but if they have local vendors, seeing if we can't get maintenance contracts for those to improve our maintenance and testing. And then, as was discussed previously, the board is aware, hardening, undergrounding of power to our critical facilities. We would like to see that happen. Where possible or feasible, we would like to configure the circuits so that they're dedicated just to our facilities. That will eliminate phase imbalance, power quality issues that we might have otherwise. And then perhaps combine the undergrounding with transmission lines from our wells to central reservoir facilities. So that would improve our ability to improve the operation of and efficiency of our distribution system. We also sustained some damage to our warehouse. As the board might be aware, that's just a metal structure. So we will consider hardening, having a new hardened central warehouse facility, and then for the purposes of storm preparation and preparedness, having auxiliary storage facilities at regional sites that we could put specifically what we need for those facilities in that region, of the appropriate size and quantity, so that during response we're able to access those more quickly than we were during this storm. For example, northern and central, we could put We would have deep well and booster pump station and lift station equipment, perhaps at Northern District or Hagana wastewater treatment plant with critical spares of equipment for those plants. And then for the southern equipment for UGM, surface water treatment plant, and any booster or lift stations in the south. We also would look at expanding our fleet, increase the number of water tankers and tractors that we have for our own inventory, and then of course vacuum and combination trucks on the wastewater side. These were necessary in order to manage flows at some of the smaller pump stations during the post-storm recovery and to prevent sewer system overflows. And then we would look to establish and fit out regional emergency operation centers, including bunking facilities for staff that have to hunker down. We did this at Northern District, at UGM, and at the Upper Tumon facility, even though don't have any place that's built for that, so we might want to do that in the future. We would also have a communication base station regionally that would have helped us in the south if we had that. And also kitchen shower facilities and first aid facilities. We would also look at developing a long-term resiliency plan, analyzing our recent storm damage response and recovery data, look at specific facility level improvements for long-term resiliency. Also consider the effects of climate change and how that might be impacting the severity of storms that we see and the damage that we would see. And then also work with DoD to look at interoperability opportunities. We kind of had to do that out of necessity in this response. Fortunately, it was a cooperative effort. I think a little bit of advanced planning would be welcomed by all of the parties. Try to get out in front of that the next time. And then also integrate any needs for emerging contaminants and evolving regulatory requirements as part of the long-term resiliency. So we did, in conjunction with FEMA, who has expressed interest in resiliency projects and was polling us for information, we did come up with some potential initiatives, including UGM surface water treatment plant, a new dam, a debris diversion structure, hardening the intake pump station with automatic screening, and a raw water reservoir. Some of this was already in our planning horizon. As the board may recall, we have Bureau of Reclamation doing a watershed study at UGM right now with the purpose of figuring out what type of improvements would help us with long-term resiliency, and then hopefully allowing us to apply for grants to get those constructed. So this would just hasten that if we were to move forward. Additional water resources, bringing those into production, ASORP Maui Well and Tamuning Santa Rita Springs, which we're already using, the Aspen Springs, which is currently in process of being rehabilitated. Getting those online and more resilient would help us. And then for northern production, looking at, as a long-term initiative, realigning some of the well locations to be in more productive and healthier areas of the aquifer subbasins. For short term, we've identified some water production reliability projects, the surface water treatment plant rehab, which is going to move forward, deep well emergency power generation, and deep well rehabilitation. Next slide. This is the surface water intake. You can see some of the debris there. This is after the staff had already cleared some of it. Next slide. For the water distribution system, focusing on water loss reduction, getting our pressure zone realignment done, and moving forward with pipe replacements. If we had reduced our water losses, our recovery would have been quicker. So that's something that we can do in the short term. Brigade water booster pump station, rehabilitating that to provide intake from two water sources simultaneously. We could have pushed more water from UGM, which was operating fine, towards Santa Rita, which had a shortage. So Brigade will be able to do that. And then, of course, getting our SCADA system implemented and more widely distributed amongst our facilities island-wide. Next slide. This is a picture of an uprooted tree that pulled up picture is the access to our GWA sewage pump station. Road is submerged, probably at that point, you see the back, the top of the vehicle gate, which is about 4 feet. So that's 3 feet of water. Our guys have requested for the next storm that we deploy a Zodiac so that they can get to the pump station.
We can't just backfill it and you know, to bring up the road level, or is it pretty massive, the amount of flooding that was in there?
That's just the road. The station itself, the water had come up to almost the roof line. We'll show you the picture in a second. On the collection system, pump station rehab and hardening, Yanya Main was subjected to flooding. The GWA pump station is subjected to flooding, and then for some of the sewer pump stations, new installation for sites with no generators, that's mostly down south, the small ones that are in the right of way that we don't have room for. We have to figure out a way to do that. And then, of course, vacuum truck fleet expansion, that's a short-term option. Next slide. So this is the last slide. This is the interior seating line. This is the level of the water. These are the electrical control panels. Perched to within about 2 feet of the ceiling. So that is there's nothing we can do to harden the facility to prevent that. So what we have suggested to FEMA is that there needs to be a joint project with DPW to address stormwater disposal in that general area so that it doesn't.
Where is this area?
This is, yeah, you know where VFW is? In GWA off of Route 1, right off of Route 1?
Oh, yeah.
That commercial building?
Yeah.
Just behind it.
Oh, that's in that kind of like going down into the GGO school, right? There's a school that's in kind of low-lying area there.
I don't know if there's a school in that area. If D.L. Perez is that in GWA? That's close, that's on Gadjingero. This is before that, south of that, I think.
So like you're talking about putting in some sort of ponding basin?
Well, there is one there, but it's concrete lined and it's not been maintained. So every time I've gone there, there's standing water. I mean, eventually it seeps, but it just doesn't dispose of it
Doesn't
fast
percolate.
enough. So either they rehabilitate or expand that, or maybe they put in an injection well. I'm not a big fan because it's in Gigo and there's, that's a straight line into the aquifer. But there's got to be something else that needs to be done. The point is that we don't have the jurisdiction to handle that on our own. We can't make site improvements that are going to solve this problem. It needs to be shared responsibility with DPW.
And we can't build on top of it? I mean, that would be the simple solution, right? It's just to elevate it.
Relocate.
I mean, you could relocate it, but that's a lot of infrastructure to relocate.
It doesn't solve the problem of storm, even if it solves the problem of maybe getting the controls out of the floodway, but all the flood water, that still makes its way through our manholes into our system, and we're disposing and pumping of more water than we should be, because it's not being separated and kept out. So that's the end of the presentation.
So Miguel, what I'd, maybe for the regular meeting, if you can kind of just do like some sort of Pareto, like, okay, these are the biggest issues we face and these are the corrective actions. Obviously, it looks like power generation was the largest issue.
Affecting us during this past storm, yeah.
Right, so whether it was island power, from the grid, having it available, or backup generation power, right? That's a single biggest impact on the system, right? That if we could have addressed that, we could have expedited some of the recovery times, right?
Yes.
And so just in that fashion, like here's, the low-hanging fruit, this is what we need to do. I know you addressed, the fuels, because even if you had backup generation, you still had an issue with fuel delivery, right? Because I think the entire island did.
Yeah. So the scheduling part and making sure that we hit the stations that needed it. Different stations have different draws and then different size and different days of supply at full operation. So coordinating all of that was part of the difficulty, the availability. We always had at least one truck from the vendor, but the vendor, all the other vendors' customers were also screaming for fuel delivery because the port had an issue with the rack that filled all these. So it ended up being limited, and then we had.
You
But-
only had one vendor, one fuel vendor?
GPA has one fuel vendor to handle all the refueling at water and wastewater. I don't know if there's a different vendor for their like CTs and their.
You might want to consider like a IDIQ on your next procurement, right? So everybody that bids, right, that you might have the first priority come in with the lowest bid, but then you'll have all these tertiary, secondary and tertiary vendors that they may have a different bid rate, but at least you have access to them rather than, having to
Use
only
just one.
patronize one vendor and not get fuel like when you need to.
I will say that despite the challenges, the fuel supply was not the issue, right? It was plenty of fuel. Just getting it into the trucks was the issue.
Yeah, everybody had that because I think the Scullies, the gantries down at the port had generation power issues. They couldn't pump. They couldn't, because we do this work too, right? On the commercial side, but they couldn't pump the fuel tankers because they didn't have any. Just like, kind of these are the biggest hitters. What could have.
I think you did a great job.
Yeah.
Really, to recover in 30 days. A lot of people don't realize in the mainland you have utilities, sister utilities that are close by, and they just drive in, with their trucks and all their equipment. They just drive in, and they're ready to go. Good.
So did you want to go through, are you tired of hearing me talk? Do you want to go through the report? Do you want to save it to the meeting, or?
Yeah, I think this one was more important. This
Yeah.
The recovery plan. It was comprehensive.
Could you do this? Could you load it on board books so we can see it?
Sure.
And then if we have any specific questions, we'll talk about it at the meeting, right?
Okay.
How's that?
Recall that there is more detail in the written report that I gave you at the last meeting. If you
Yeah.
still need need copies of that, let me know. I have.
No, I have.
Okay.
All right, but we'll load the presentation on board.
So what's the comms plans for this then? Are we going out and doing any kind of communication on this, or is this just for internal use to prepare us for the next typhoon?
About the presentation?
Yeah.
Presentation was for public. We can put it out.
Mm-hmm.
We just didn't want to do that before you had the opportunity to see it. Now that you've seen it,
Mm-hmm.
but the written report is
Mm-hmm.
discussed.
The corrective action plans on whether you're going to purchase new generators for these sites that them or funds for non-operational on a maintenance. How are you funding that? Is that through the current surcharge?
So the surcharge is if they use it for capital, I'm sure they're using it for maintenance, but if they're going to use it, I believe that's on our side. Discussions that I've had with John B. are if we already have a CIP project for our facilities needs a new generator, then we'll build it into. We want to have just. So we'll build it into our CIP, and the maintenance, once it's built, then the maintenance is. That was our arrangement. So I think now that still would be our plan, because we do have trades out of our. But as far as the maintenance now, whether we go with a tractor, still need to work. Part of it, that's part of this boils down to what wants. I think it was the board's gave maintaining our generator. So
It's actually a law. It was the law. The bond issued and the law indicated that GPA would do this. It set the PUC up, set the rate that they would have, that they would be able to keep this project, to do it.
How long ago was?
Oh, God. It was back when I was on the PUC.
So it's been a long time.
Yeah, 1994, before 1994. So, you know, I mean.
Maybe we need to revisit it.
Yeah,
Maybe we need
I
to
think we need to
how-
revisit the law, make changes. You know, no,
no. Well, the ones that we don't have permanent generator installations are, for example, driving from in the Lahan, the injector stations along the side of the road. Essentially, you just see a pad, a
And two
steel
pipes.
cover, and two vent pipes.
Yeah.
Those are all underground, and it's in the right of way, so there isn't enough room to put in a building in. Right, so what we are thinking is for those, what we might have to do is work. We'll acquire property, but then we can put one large generator to serve multiple.
Oh.
The power line right
Underground.
away. That's
Yeah, but how? I mean, those locations miles away, right? They're not
I don't think they're that.
just because you lose generation over that distance.
Yeah, it might require multiple.
Yeah.
But if we acquire one small property, we can serve 3 ejector stations.
Yeah, makes sense.
I remember the old days, they just used to put a temporary generator, somebody had to keep putting gas in. It was bad.
But then
So,
the neighbor will have it
yeah,
2 days later.
no, because they actually were chaining,
It's
Michael.
like the only house with
No,
power. It's like,
Michael, they used to chain these things with a padlock.
oh, they still do. I saw
Yeah.
the Docomo one on Machechi that was chained up to the power pole.
I think you guys had a wager going to see who was going to take the FEMA one that was controlling the traffic light here on Route
Yeah,
15.
yeah, that one was wide open.
So
Anyway,
we,
thank you very much. Good,
I'll
good
have
report.
an updated table with the hanging.
Okay. This is the first major storm that GWA has gone through as under the CCU as a really professional. And they've gone through a lot of storms. But you don't go through this kind of review. We're doing well. It's only going to get better. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
That's
everybody.
it. Motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Motion.
To
Motion,
adjourn.
second.
Yep.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye, opposed nay, motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.